Welcome again to our weekly online Bible study here at Pine Valley Church of Christ. We have begun a new study that we are calling Guard the Gospel, which is a look at Paul's letters to Titus and to Timothy. These are the last three that he writes before he dies, and it's a continuation of our focus this year, which has been on looking at people who are at the end of their life and they are reflecting on what they consider to be truly important to other Christians that they want to pass on to them. We saw in the letters of Peter, the things that he reflected on. We've looked at Ecclesiastes and the life and wisdom of Solomon as he looks back on his life and what he found to be truly important. And now we are into these last letters in the life of Paul. Just as an FYI, after this, we will conclude the year by looking at those words of Jesus in John chapter 13 through 17, those words that he shares with his disciples the night before he dies. And so let me get our screen share going. So we have begun to focus first on the letter to Titus. I wanted to do this one first because it's shorter. It's often referred to as a mini version of First Timothy. They do cover a lot of same things, but there's a lot of unique material as well. And so I wanted to give it its due first, and then we can look at the letters to Timothy together and the things that are shared by Paul right after his release from Roman imprisonment to later when it is just he is in his second imprisonment in Rome and is about to die in 2 Timothy. As we get into Timothy chapter 1, the overall theme is blameless. We all can remember somebody or think of someone in our life that you hear the word blameless and that person comes to your head. One of mine is my father, because he was not only blameless in his family life, he was blameless in his professional life and his life of faith before God. And he showed that to others, and others could see it. And this is a particular emphasis for Paul to Titus, who is working on the Isle of Crete with people who are not blameless. They are completely and totally opposite of that. And this becomes sort of the theme through this chapter of the kind of people that the church needs to lead it, and some of their function, what they do, especially in contrast to and in response to the teachings of these false teachers. As we looked at last week, Paul has been released. This letter is written probably around 64, 65 AD. There has apparently been a Crete mission trip, and Paul has been there. We don't know who else might have been there except Titus, because we are told that he has left him behind. So he has been there, he has gone on. We see in chapter 3 that he has gone on to Nicopolis, which is in current day Albania, just northwest of Greece. He says he's going to winter there, and he wants Titus to try to come to him when some other folks show up to help with the work in Crete. But he says, I left you behind because there's unfinished business. And that business begins with, it's not just the appointment of elders, but it is first that. And that is why he, from verse 5 through 9, his immediate need. And this is not uncommon for Paul. We know that at the end of his first missionary journey, back in Acts chapter 14, that as he and Barnabas made their way back to Antioch, they revisited all the places where they had been, and they appointed elders in every city. And so he understands the need for there being stable leadership within each congregation of the church, because he's seldom going to be one place very long. In fact, Ephesus is the only place he spends a couple of years at. He was about 18 months in Corinth. And most other places, it was not even that long. And so there are, he visits again, he'll send Titus somewhere, he'll send Timothy somewhere. But most of these places were then led by these men who were seen to be blameless. And this is particularly important to this background in Ephesus, or in Crete. Again, there's a difference in the two churches, the one in Crete and the one in Ephesus, where Timothy is ministering. The Ephesian church has been around for a while, and the Ephesian church has had elders for a while. And so probably why when he talks about the appointment of elders to Timothy, it's not until chapter 3. These are newer churches. He sees this as an urgent need to get this leadership in place. And so it is the first thing that he wants to talk about. Before he does that, he talks about his own mission in the opening verses. That is, he is a servant and an apostle. And this is the only letter he writes, and where in the opening he refers to him as a servant. He says his work is about building faith and knowledge that lead to godliness. And beginning in chapter 2, where he starts specifically telling Titus what to teach to certain people, you can see him following along this very line of thought, because that is the goal, is for us to become more godly rather than like the world around us. And it is about his gospel and the hope that is there. It's been revealed in his message to these people, and this is what God has commanded him to do, and what he has dedicated his life to for many years now. After beginning by persecuting God's people, those early Christians, he now has committed his life to doing everything he can to preach the gospel to Gentiles. And he knows he doesn't have much time left, but he says, I'm going to do everything I can in the meantime. And he closes out those first 4 verses with this loving reference to Titus, my true son. We looked quickly last week at the background of his relationship with Titus. He's not mentioned in the book of Acts, but we know in Galatians chapter 2, he is talked about as an individual who came with Paul and Barnabas as a part of the group of Christians in Antioch who came to Jerusalem to have the discussion in Acts 15 about the teachers who had gone to Antioch, Jewish Christians who were saying that the people had to follow the law of Moses and circumcision before they could be saved. And of course, the outcome of that discussion is no, they do not. They are saved by grace through faith. And that is the message that Paul has taken with him. But as we're going to see here in chapter 1, there's still some of those people around, and they're on Crete because we know in Acts 2, there were people from Crete at the day of Pentecost. We don't know if they took that message home with them, what happened with it. But we do know there's been that recent mission trip, and there's been some already disturbances within the community there by people with this Jewish background. And who better to send into that situation than Titus, who had been a part of all that same kind of thing in Antioch. He'd gone to the conference in Jerusalem and then went back home to convey the decision that was made. So he's dealt with this kind of stuff. And so Paul, I think, takes him with him and leaves him behind because of that background. He gets now, beginning in verse 5, into this unfinished business. And he says, here's the reason I left you behind in Crete, was to set right what is left undone, and as I directed you, to appoint elders in every town. It's important that there be these leaders in every city and every congregation of God's people. This is a tradition that goes back even to the days of Moses. And we are told in Exodus chapter 18, when his father-in-law Jethro comes to visit Moses, he sees Moses has way too much burden on himself, and he encourages him to appoint other leaders who he trains, who are able men, who are God-fearing, who are trustworthy, and not lovers of money. And we're going to see that concept come up throughout this discussion here and why it is important. But Paul says it's important that congregations have elders and overseers. He uses two different words, one in verse 5 and verse 6, and then verse 7, the one in 5 and 6 are the ones we normally translate as elder. Verse 7, he switches to the other word, which we translate normally as overseer or manager, and it is used in 1 Timothy 3. And so he uses both descriptions. He's trying to give them a good picture here of what it is, and it begins with that he is blameless. That first phrase in verse 6, an elder must be blameless. Now he's going to go on and help define exactly what that is. It's not the way in which the world looks at things, but it is how we should be looking at this as the people of God, and who are looking for leaders who can help lead us in faith and knowledge and godliness. He says, and it all begins at home. He is to be the husband of one wife, or more literally, he is a one-woman man. He is faithful. He is has faithful children who are not accused of wildness or rebellion. It all starts at home. One commentator made the observation that the home and the family is the good training ground or breeding ground of good Christian leaders. You see what kind of relationship they have with their family. The Christian Standard Version, I think, has it correct when they translate it with faithful children who are not accused of wildness and neglect. Other translations, NIV, ESV, some others, go ahead and they interpret the word. The word is literally that they are faithful. It can also be translated trustworthy or dependable. And the word is actually in their relationship to their father. To interpret it and then translate it into that they are believers is making an interpretation, and also it is requiring something here that is not required at the church in Ephesus. It could be that Paul is doing that. I don't think he is. I think he's actually saying the same thing that he says over in 1 Timothy 3. Where he emphasizes the importance of he manages his household well, and his children are not wild and rebellious. In other words, and he says, because if someone can't manage their own household, how can he help manage the household of God? And that's the same picture. If you look here, what he's saying, if he says, and they're faithful or trustworthy children in their relationship, dependable or even obedient children who are not accused of wildness and rebellion. That's the last half of the verse defines what he's talking about here. And so he's giving us this picture of the kind of family he's wanting to have. And this last part has biblical basis to it. If we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 2, Eli is accused of, who is priest. He has appointed two of his sons to be priests as well, and they are doing whatever they want to rather than following the law of God. They are wild and rebellious, even though they are priests. And Samuel ends up prophesying against him for not managing his children. He has not done what was necessary to control them, and especially by putting them into positions of authority, which they are misusing. But then we see it again in Samuel's own life. In chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, when the people come to Samuel asking for a king, one of the reasons they give is, you're getting old and your children do not follow your example, and they are lovers of money and are perverting justice. And so you say, we'd rather have a king. And we see this throughout the Bible. Lots of godly people. King David's children didn't all turn out so great. It's a problem, but people get to when they become adults, they start making bad decisions. But when you're talking about your household, are you in control of your household? And are you a good father? Are you a faithful husband? That's the picture that he is drawing, and he draws that same picture over in Timothy. I mentioned this Sunday, we have a tendency when we get to these passages to immediately take them both and make a list out of them, which makes it into more of a checklist rather than a picture that is being drawn, and mash them together. And there are things that are different in each list. There are 15 things in each description. 9 of them are either identical or they use similar words or similar phrasing to describe the same type of thing. Each description has 6 things that are unique. And we're going to look at that in just a little bit. But that's why we want to look at this in the context of what was going on in Crete. It draws the same picture. He just uses some different words, which would mean important things to those who are living in Crete and who are seeking to be leaders of God's people in that. Because again, as he begins verse 7, as an overseer, a manager of God's household, he must be blameless. And so what does he go on to describe? He is not arrogant or overbearing or stubborn. He is not, he goes through this list of not things. He is not hot-tempered. And oftentimes those two things go together. Some believe that he keeps giving us double descriptions here. One that is dependent, the second is dependent on the first one. He's not an excessive drinker and not a bully, which oftentimes excessive drinking can lead to being bully or even hot-tempered. There's a connection between this, and he's not greedy for money. The very thing that Jethro warned Moses about, the very thing that Eli's children were accused of and Samuel's children were accused of. And these are things that we find condemned throughout the teachings of Jesus and are part of that list of sins of the flesh in Galatians chapter 5. In other words, they're not allowing their own natural instincts and desires to be in control of their life, but rather they are under the control of the Holy Spirit, seeking godliness, which leads to a life under control, a life which is hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, righteous, holy, self-controlled. That last word for self-control is the same one used in the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5. And he says, all of this is necessary to show the kind of person that they are. And the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, Jesus talks about you'll know the people of God and you'll know false teachers by the fruits that they produce. Here are the fruits that you see in a man who is godly and blameless. But then it gets down to, he says, and ultimately they have to, this is part of, we've talked about the person, now let's talk about part of their ministry is to hold to the faithful message as taught, so that he'll be able both to encourage with sound teaching and to refute those who contradict it. He can do that because of the person that he is, that the Spirit is in control of his life. He is a godly person rather than one who is still giving in to his own selfish wants and desires. And he holds on to that faithful message so that he can encourage with sound teaching and refute those who contradict it. To Timothy, Paul just writes, they're able to teach. And again, he's writing to a more mature congregation who's had leaders before. And so they know what he means by that. Here in Crete, with these new Christians, he gives them a fuller definition. They hold to the faithful message as taught, what he has revealed to them, so that they can encourage and they can refute. And they encourage or refute with sound or healthy teaching. And we see, the phrase sound doctrine or sound teaching. The word for sound also means healthy, that which leads to good health. And that's what he's wanting them to do, is promote good spiritual health. And so as you see that phrase from now on, just thinking, think in your mind, he's talking about healthy teaching, that which leads to spiritual health, which includes refuting those who contradict what is wrong. Because he says right here, in your own situation and in your own churches, already here in Crete, there are those who are rebellious. And he goes on to describe them specifically in verses 10 through 14, and even more in 15 and 16, that they're full of empty words and full of deception. The description, full of empty talk. A person who thinks they know everything, they like to talk about it, they want to share their opinion about every little thing because they think they know more than everybody else. But he says this is all empty, and it's actually part of their deception, and especially those from the circumcision party. So there's more than one group of rebellious people here, but he picks out the circumcision party, because apparently they are a big part of a lot of the trouble that's going on. He even brings it up again later. Talks about Jewish myths and the commands of men, both which came out of the background in their Jewish religion. But he says, instead of really trying to build people up and encourage them and help them lead to godliness, it says they're actually ruining entire households, tearing them apart by teaching things they shouldn't do, and it's all for dishonest gain. They, end of verse 8, they get money dishonestly. End of verse 11. He says, and they're just following their own sort of inner, animal instincts. And he quotes their own prophet, who from, the quote comes from 600 BC, that Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. That evil beasts can also be stubborn or rebellious. They're just following their own instincts. They're not wanting to do what they need to do, rather than just what they want to do. So that leads to lying. It leads to seeking to gain dishonestly from other people, rather than trying to build them up. And Paul even says himself, the beginning of verse 13, this testimony is true. He's been there, he's seen it, he knows. And says, for this reason, you need to rebuke them sharply, so that they'll remain sound in the faith and may not pay attention to Jewish myths and commands of people and who reject the truth. It's the same type of phrasing Jesus uses of the Pharisees and Sadducees in Mark 7, where they come to him and are asking about, why don't your disciples wash their hands ceremonially before they eat like we do? And Jesus quotes from Isaiah 29 and just reminds them that what they have done in promoting their traditions is they have created human commands, and they are preempting the word of God, or the commands of God, with the commands of humans. And that's what he is giving as the description of who these people are. And they're doing that same kind of thing. And he gives us a glimpse into some other things there in verse 15, to the pure, everything is pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. Similar to a situation we see in the book of Galatians, where some were saying, you can't marry, you can't eat certain kinds of food. And it went back to some of the traditions found in certain areas of Judaism, but they brought over into trying to control others by getting them to follow them because they think they know better. In fact, that's how he concludes in verse 16. They claim to know God, but they deny him by their works. They show that they are producing bad fruit, as Jesus talks about in Matthew 7. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for any good work. That last phrase is they are not just unfit, but they are unable to do it. They don't want to, for one thing. Number two, they just don't have it. They're not blameless. They are not the kind of people that need to be in this kind of situation, leading God's people. And so he tells Timothy and these elders or overseers that he's going to be appointing, that part of their responsibility is to silence them. It is necessary, verse 11, to silence them. The word there can be translated muzzle, as you would an animal. Of course, later on, he says, verse 13, rebuke them sharply. This is doing damage to the household of God. And this household picture plays throughout Titus and the letters to Timothy. We are a family. We are a household who have come together. And we need good men who are blameless to lead the household, who have already shown that they can do these things by what they've done in their household, and then can help deal with these who are trying to tear these things down. So he says, look for these blameless men. Now here I wanted just to share with you quickly the 6 things in Titus's description of the blameless elder or overseer that are not in the list that Paul writes to Timothy. They're not arrogant or authoritarian. They're not hot-tempered. They love what is good. They're upright, holy, and self-controlled and disciplined. This does not say that the elders in Ephesus shouldn't be this way. There are some similarities in some of the other words that are used there. But again, he's writing to a different group of people who are at a different level of maturity and history as a church and in a different cultural situation. This is for these folks in Crete. And think about what he's just talked about and how he's described these false teachers and what they're doing, and how important it is to have men then who are not arrogant, which false teachers are not hot-tempered, which apparently the false teachers were. They love what is good rather than just themselves or love money. They're upright, holy, and self-controlled, where he refers to the Cretans as just mindless beasts or evil beasts, following their own instincts and desires rather than those of God. So he uses this within the Cretan culture to draw the same picture that he draws in 1 Timothy, but uses these unique words and descriptions to help them best understand and best deal with the situation that they face in Crete. We'll see the same thing over in 1 Timothy 3 in a few weeks. But this is what he's been talking about, that you seek this blameless. But as he already indicated in those opening verses, that his goal is to build faith and knowledge that leads to godliness. Part of that is to seek this blamelessness. We must never take these passages and say only elders or church leaders are held to this standard. He's actually saying these are the people who have reached a point in spiritual maturity that all of us should be seeking. This comes out very plainly in his letter to the Philippians, who was written while he was in prison in Rome. And he tells them in chapter 2, for it is God who is working in you both to will and to work according to his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling and arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world by holding firm to the word of life. This is written to the entire church. This isn't written to the preacher. It's not written to the elders or deacons or any. This is everybody. So do these things. Understand that God is working in you. And do these godly things, these good works, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation. We definitely, in our own day and time, live in a crooked and perverted generation. And it is so important that we seek to be blameless and pure and faultless in this world so that we can shine like stars. The world has to see that we are different. They have to see the fruit that we are producing that shows that we are different. And so this is a goal that we all have each and every day as we seek to follow Jesus, and we move along that path that Paul set out in those first verses, that we seek greater faith and supported by knowledge, leading to godliness, the way that which these things are lived. It's not just about professing a faith in Jesus. It's not just about gaining knowledge. It's about putting all that into practice in the way in which we live every day. And so let us pray each day that we will be blameless and pure and faultless, children of God who are shine like stars in this perverted generation in which we live. Thank you for joining us for our class again this week. We'll be moving into Titus chapter 2 for next week, and he gets more specific there about Titus's teaching to certain groups. And again, all of it part of that goal of seeking godliness, but an overriding theme through them is that just like the elders are to be lovers of what is good, that they all do good. That is part of that path to godliness as we put the faith and the teaching into practice every day to the benefit of others, unlike the false teachers who are only out for their own gain. So that's where we'll be going in the weeks to come. Thank you for joining us. In the meantime, may God bless you and keep you safe.